Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President and a conservation leader. Theodore Roosevelt was born into a rich Dutch family in New York State. Struggling with sickness and almost near blindness during his childhood, he found love in nature. As a child, he adored the outdoors and animals of all kinds. Roosevelt spent a multitude of time studying both subjects. After becoming president, Roosevelt relayed his love for nature and conservation into the creation of national parks, game reserves, and legislation protecting wildlife. To present day, he is probably known as the greatest conservation leader. Roosevelt's birth into a wealthy family afforded him many opportunities as a child. Roosevelt's parents were loving, encouraging, and expected their 3 children to be educated. One specific incident in Roosevelt's childhood, which is defined by him in his autobiography as the spark of his interest into zoology and nature. He recalls walking down a street in his hometown and coming across the carcass of a seal. He began to study the seal's body immensely, taking measurements and creating a natural history out of his findings. Roosevelt even took the skull of the seal home with him and began his own natural museum in his bedroom. After he started his own personal natural history museum, his parents encouraged his learning and purchased him a book by author Mayne Reid. Reid had published a book on mammals that was filled with photos and statistics of a multitude of animals. Roosevelt's fascination grew. His parents enrolled him into a taxidermy class, where he developed a particular passion for the stuffing and preserving of animals. At the age of 14, Roosevelt and his siblings were sent overseas for the summer to travel and study. In Egypt, Roosevelt picked up a book that provided pictures and information on the various bird species that inhabited the region. Throughout the trip, he collected various birds that he would eventually donate to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. Education was something that was extremely important to Roosevelt. Upon his arrival home from overseas, he began to spend time in his college prep, along with studying natural history more in depth. Roosevelt entered Harvard University at the age of 18, and his studying continued. His father had always taught him that business was the track to take in order to be successful in life. Roosevelt took this advice to heart, but soon learned that he didn't have much interest in the topics that he was studying. His father encouraged him to study what he loved, but be prepared to make the proper sacrifices that came along with a career in which making a lot of money wasn't always possible. Roosevelt knew the risks and decided he wanted to be a scientific man like the authors of the many books he had read. Roosevelt began to study natural science at Harvard with great passion. However, he found that the classes there focused too much on being in the laboratory. As a naturalist, Roosevelt's interest lay in the outside world, the forests, animals, and our interactions with nature. He was disappointed to find that this type of information was not what he was going to be learning, and struggled with scientific Latin. Roosevelt then made the decision that would change his life and decided to focus his education on politics. After he graduated from Harvard, he entered into Columbia Law School. Once again, however, he realized that being a lawyer was not something that he wanted to do with his life, and made the ultimate decision to run for office. He ran for office to the New York State Assembly and was elected, and he became quite an activist. He supported many bills which benefited the poor and passed more bills than any individual in the state's legislative history. In 1884, Roosevelt experienced one of the greatest tragedies and life-changing events in his life. His mother and wife died in the same year. He left the assembly and moved to the Badlands of Dakota, where his love for nature grew even further. He purchased ranches where he learned to ride horses. In his autobiography, he would marvel at the beauty of the land and the wildlife. He worked hard to learn the life of a cattle rancher and spent almost 2 years in the Dakotas. Roosevelt soon remarried and rejoined public life. He held several political positions as on his way to the White House. He was the New York Police Commissioner for a brief time and radically altered the way the stations were run by opening up positions for minorities. When William McKinley became president, he was given the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy. As with all his positions in public office, he worked to rid out corruption and garnered national attention. Roosevelt was asked to join the presidential ticket for McKinley, and in 1900 they entered the presidency and vice presidency. Roosevelt found little pleasure in the position, as it was thought to have no real power or influence in American politics. However, in 1901, McKinley was shot and killed, and Roosevelt was unexpectedly thrust into the highest political position in America. As president, Roosevelt championed his love of natural history. In a message to Congress, he stated, "Optimism is a good characteristic, but if carried to an excess, it becomes foolishness. We are prone to speak of the resources of this country as exhaustible. This is not so." One of the first national parks that he helped to establish was the Crater Lake National Park. Crater Lake is the deepest lake in the United States and had long been a place of historical importance to the Native Americans. William Steele was a huge proponent for the park, and in 1902, Roosevelt accepted Steele's proposal and Crater Lake National Park was created. The age of conservation was beginning in the United States thanks to Roosevelt, a huge proponent of any legislation introduced in regards to saving American land. In 1903, Pelican Island in Florida was created as the first bird reservation and federal wildlife refuge in America. Wichita Forest was next. It was set up as a protected forest by McKinley in 1901. However, Roosevelt saw it as a national game reserve to help protect the dwindling bison population, which had gone from over 60 million to just a few thousand. As the American population began to further expand westward and more interest began growing in protecting some of the areas there. Just as Wichita Game Reserve was established to protect the bison, many conservationists began to grow worried about the protection of Native American ruins. An act was established by Congress that allowed the president to proclaim historic landmarks and monuments protected without having to go through approval. The American Antiquities Act provisioned for legitimate archaeological dig permits. Roosevelt opened the act up for interpretation and in 1908 used it to protect 800,000 acres of Grand Canyon and deemed it a national monument after a failed attempt to create the area into a national park. In May of 1908, Roosevelt called the first Conference of Governors, bringing all the governors, members of the Supreme Court, and representatives from various organizations together. Roosevelt started the conference in stating that conservation was one of the largest problems facing the nation. He believed the natural resources were at a risk of being destroyed if society kept up with its practices. Gifford Pinchot was a leading conservationist during the time, and he gave many presentations on solutions to fix issues relating to all facets of the environment. The results of the conference led to raised realization on the national and international stage. Along with the meeting came the creation of the National Conservation Commission. In June 1908, the National Conservation Commission was established. It included members of Congress and was used to discuss conservation of the nation's vast natural resources. One of the main tasks the commission had was to take an inventory, and they were separated into 4 groups. In 1908, Roosevelt declined to run for president, and Taft was chosen and easily elected as President of the United States. With Roosevelt's presidency over, he headed to Africa to go on safari. While here with his son and over 250 guides, they collected over 1,100 specimens, including 500 big game. It was among the largest collections. Theodore Roosevelt is often looked to as a president of great accomplishments. He is perhaps one of the first presidents who honestly took an interest in preserving the natural beauty of our country. Throughout his presidency, he set up a multitude of programs and protected over 200 million acres. Without his contribution, some of the nation's greatest treasures may have been destroyed, and that is why Teddy Roosevelt is seen as the greatest conservation leader.